Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today rebuilding economic theory the old way. It's great that some economists are looking at models and theories that they've relied on for decades and starting to question their merit. But are they talking a fundamental rethink, or are they just tweaking the edges? You might be encouraged to know that the Oxford Review of Economic Policy, in its latest journal, has devoted the entire edition to rebuilding macroeconomic theory. Now, this is an acknowledgement, perhaps, that the models that have guided economists and central banks for decades might be flawed and in need of review. So, Steve, I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at a piece by Olivier Blanchard, for example, questioning the value of DSGE models and the need for models that are based on more empirical evidence. This is great news, isn't it? This is a step in the right direction, surely.
Well, it's a step in the right direction if you're doing line dancing. Because the whole, and this is one of the reasons why I'm actually very glad to be involved with the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, NIESR, Rebuilding Macroeconomic Theory program, because that's quite independent of what the Oxford Review of Economic Policy has put out. And as the NIESR said, it's got a much broader picture of what might be necessary to reform economic theory than what the Oxford Review has done. Because first of all, you look at the list of people in the Oxford Review, there's no one there with any street cred in terms of being a non-mainstream thinker. The only people who are at all non-mainstream, and this is important, are two members of the Bank of England, Andy Haldane and a researcher with him. They're the only ones who have had any track record whatsoever of thinking beyond the models that economists currently use, which are called these DSGE models. First of all, they presume the economy is either in equilibrium or not very far from it and will tend back to it after any shock coming from outside the economy. That's the first assumption of the DSGE model.
And in fact, in that Olivier Blanchard, I did read quite a few of these, although I paid less attention after the first one. But Olivier Blanchard, yes, his starting point was that everyone is in agreement that macroeconomics is about general equilibrium. Which is
in fact, of all things, that was after a debate that included me, and I was actually one of the people he cited as being part of the discussion. I said, here are 3 points we can all agree upon. Let's not discuss them further and move on. One, macroeconomics is about general equilibrium, and my reaction was, no, it's effing not. It's about general, but it's general non-equilibrium. Equilibrium is a particular state of the economy in an entire range of different states that it can be in. Now, what they, and this is where they've got themselves locked into a mindset which is based on a sensible idea, but converted into a fallacy.
Let's just for people like me who don't necessarily understand the core of this argument. I mean, the idea of equilibrium is that we buy and sell, and there's a stability in that in the long run. The economy is going to balance itself out. The economy is not going to run out of control. That's basically what's meant by equilibrium. But if the economy is self-correcting, why do we need central banks, for example?
Yeah, indeed. But what they're starting from is the original economic theory had supply and demand. If you have an isolated market, you consider demand in that market and supply in that market and price causing equilibrium between the two. You don't consider what happens if that market has supply greater than demand. How does that affect other markets? And that's You went from what they call partial equilibrium analysis to a general equilibrium analysis. But in fact, the real world is not and never will be in equilibrium. And in fact, there's a wonderful Hungarian economist called János Kornai, who had a book he called Anti-Equilibrium, he published back in the 1970s. And his argument was that equilibrium is an incredibly boring state for a capitalist economy. You actually want pressure, and he called it demand pressure. You want a demand pressure greater than pressure on trying to get demand greater than pressure on coming from the supply side, to mean that you had firms being forced to innovate to get the public's demand, and that innovation causing change over time and evolution of the system to having more complex products, more interesting technology. That's what you want. That's the dynamism you want in a capitalist economy. And in that situation, you will not have equilibrium. And equilibrium, you see, you compared equilibrium to like a marriage between a sterile man and a frigid woman. They'll be in equilibrium for their entire relationship and never have sex. So
I love that analogy. All right. So look, that's a bad starting point then, and because that is one thing that everybody in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy is in agreement with. DSGE models. I mean, some are saying yes, they're flawed in some way. There's some who, not all, think it should be done away with. But it doesn't seem like there's anyone who's actually saying, look, it's so flawed, we actually need to start again, which I'm sure is your view.
That's my view, and it's also saying let's actually at the moment admit nobody's got it right, and therefore take a very wide range of potential models into account. So the DSGE models, I mean, they're incredibly complicated, and they're a complicated derivation with a simple outcome. And the reason, I don't want to take you through the mathematics of trying to build one of these things, but it's incredibly laborious to get to the final stage. We end up with a model which presumes the economy is fundamentally stable and linear. So any shock, if a shock is 10 times as big, it'll cause 10 times as much in a movement. Not in the real world where if you think the shock is 10 times as big, one will might hurt your toe a bit and the other kills you. The non-linearity of the real world is effectively left out of all these models.
Well, there's a lot more to this discussion on the Oxford Review of Economic Policy and how they got it so wrong on rebuilding macroeconomic theory. If you want to hear the interview in full, then become a subscriber to Debunking Economics. Go to debunkingeconomics.com and choose one of the subscription plans in the right-hand side, or become a subscriber or supporter of Steve on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen. If you provide support for him, and all the money goes to help with his research, if you provide $10 or more per month, then you get access to all of these podcasts for free as well. I'm Phil Dobbie. Hope to see you back here soon. Thanks for listening.